Hello. So it's currently like 2:30 in the morning, but I'm still awake, so I'm gonna make a video. Um, yeah. So I've been thinking about some things today. I've got an essay due in a couple of weeks, I think, on the 6th of December, for knowledge, reality, and truth. And basically, it's whichever question I choose, it's going to be a comparison between Descartes and Plato. So it's either going to be between their conception of God and their metaphysics or their epistemology. And I was thinking about doing the God question at first, but now I'm thinking about doing the epistemology question, as I've started mainly focusing on Descartes at the minute because I feel like he's the one I'm perhaps less familiar with. Like, I did study him at college and I also studied Plato, but yeah, I feel like Descartes is the one I need to look at most, but I do need to recap on Plato as well. So specifically the Republic. But yeah, Descartes had an interesting argument for the existence of God. I don't know if I'm going to get into right now because it's kind of late. But yeah. So I was having an interesting conversation with my flatmate earlier, and we talked about quite a lot of things. I actually brought up the Cartesian argument for the existence of God, and I was asking him whether or not he thought it was a good argument. So one component of the argument that I brought up with him, or I guess one premise, is that an effect cannot be greater than its cause, or a cause must be greater than its effect. So I questioned him on that, and he said, well, that's obviously false, because what about an explosion? When you have just like a tiny little spark or a really small device that can create an extremely large explosion. And yeah, and then in that sense, the effect does appear to be much greater than the cause. But then you could say, well, the mind that was needed to create the explosive device must have been greater than the explosive device itself, and perhaps even greater than the explosion. I think the question really rests upon our human conceptions of greatness, because you could say, well, the explosion was great in that it was really big, but the explosion isn't necessarily great in the sense that it couldn't consciously create another explosion or create something beyond itself, except for destruction. It could just destroy things. And you could argue that destruction is less great than non-destruction. But yeah, so that's quite interesting. Anyway, let's think about ideas of greatness. And not just greatness, but like perfection. So this is another thing that me and my flatmate got into. There is perfection as a human concept. Okay, so we might say, oh, it's absolutely perfect day outside, the weather is perfect. What we mean by that is not necessarily perfect in the absolute sense. We mean it as in perfect, that it is really good, that it is optimal, that it is what we desire the weather to be like. But it doesn't actually mean perfect. Okay? And also, I guess on the opposite of that, what's the opposite of perfect? Non-perfection? No, because anything below perfection is surely non-perfection, meaning that that's quite a wide scope of experience. Okay, I'm gonna use non-existence, okay, as being the opposite of perfection, assuming that absolute existence is absolute perfection or whatever, and maybe it depends of the state of that existence, as to whether or not it is perfect, but I feel like I'm perhaps using a Platonic framework here by assuming that there are somehow degrees of reality, and at the highest degree of reality is the most good. And as we lose goodness, we lose reality. Or as we lose reality, we lose goodness. Getting further and further down into the cave, into the world of appearances. Yeah, so one question that we speculated on was that perfection, and I can't talk about perfection because I don't know the opposite of it, but say goodness, absolute goodness and absolute badness are actual things, but they're things that we can't experience because we have a finite experience of the world. So we might be able to experience a maximal capacity for goodness, and perhaps it's not so clear exactly where the line is, and we might be able to experience a maximal capacity or a minimal capacity for badness. And that's like our scope of experience. But then over here and over here, so between the actual scope of experience, is a realm of experience which we can't experience because of our own minds and our own perceptive frameworks and our own brain's limits. But these things nonetheless still exist. They're just inconceivable to us. And I feel like this is what a lot of religious people perhaps subscribe themselves to, because they accept that there is somehow an ultimately perfect being who exists out there, but we ourselves are not ultimately perfect, and we are in some cases unable to conceive of that ultimately perfect being, and any sort of human language we use to try to describe that perfect being will ultimately fall short and be negating. Therefore, we should not talk of that ultimately perfect being. But it doesn't even necessarily matter as to whether you talk about the being whether you talk about this perfection in terms of being and non-being, because you can just talk about it as a concept, as something we recognize. So we, again, this could just be completely contingent on the human experience, but we seem to be able to say that things are better and things are worse than other things. Okay, so that does imply that there is up and down, and exactly what that is predicated on is maybe what's interesting, because if it is purely subjective, then where exactly do you have to go with that? Do you have to say that morality is completely subjective because this is just predicated on human experience? Or is there somehow a truth beyond ourselves which determines what exactly morality is? And it's really hard to say exactly, because I think even if this place did exist, I'm not sure language would be able to comprehend it, but maybe that's a little bit of a cop-out, because, well, if you take a Cartesian perspective on reason, Descartes said that reason has absolutely no limits. Anything that can be discovered through reason, through our rational faculties. No, any innate ideas which can be discovered through reason. I'm not sure if he went as far to say that everything in general, because that would mean that sense data could also be discovered by reason, but our senses deceive us, and I haven't got that far in the meditations yet in order to make that sort of claim, so perhaps I'll have to hold back on that. But yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of, I'll talk about degrees of existence. So there's ultimate goodness, and then it goes slowly down to ultimate badness, right? And I'm interested as to whether that is just in the human mind, or if it does exist outside of ourselves. And that is so interesting, because there's so many different arguments for it. Okay, I guess one thing we have to say is, if it does just exist in our minds, does that mean it's arbitrary? Okay, I don't know. Well, not necessarily, but then I guess you'd have to say, well, why does it exist in our minds? How does it exist in our minds? And the why question we would have to relate to cause and effect, surely. Now, is it the case that we are able to conceive of things greater than ourselves, such as morality? But see, I'm going to go back to that argument about creating the explosive. So, the mind is greater than the explosive. Let's just say that. And the explosive is lesser than the mind. Okay, so that's the idea that the effect is lesser than the cause, right? So if we kept on tracing back through evolution, we wouldn't possibly, in a moral sense, I'll say, be able to create anything greater or better than that which we currently believe. If the premise is true that something greater can't be an effect of a lesser cause. So we trace it all the way back and we say there must be some divine mind which brought everything into existence and had infinite perfection. I'm kind of like going towards Descartes' idea for the existence of God here. Descartes' argument for the existence of God, which I said I was gonna like stay away from. But I guess it just happened. So a great mind. So the only way we could possibly have this conception of perfection, or this innate idea of perfection, absolute perfection, would be if something absolutely perfect put it into our minds, which then goes to follow that God must exist, because God is ultimately perfect, and lesser causes can't come from greater effects. Lesser effects, yes, that's right. But I don't know if that's a sound argument. It's hard to know. I mean, it's a sound argument if a lesser cause can't create greater effects, then it is a sound argument that the most perfect being must exist in order to put the idea of the most perfect being in our mind. But that's only if the idea of the perfect being isn't a fabricated idea, or an advantageous idea. It has to be an innate idea. It has to be an idea which is discoverable by deductive reasoning, which Descartes would say it is. But his whole framework is predicated on this idea that God does exist, because otherwise the demon could be again, I'm like throwing in ideas here that I haven't actually talked about because I've gone through this in a very weird order. But yeah, because the evil demon could be deceiving him into believing his picture of the reality is true when in fact it's false, which is interesting. Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry this video was not very structured, but I will make a video with more clarity, perhaps tomorrow. Maybe not, I can't say for certain. I'm pretty tired, so yeah. For anyone interested in reading Descartes, this is the copy I have. I'm not sure which Hackett. Yeah, so it's the Hackett publisher. Yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. I'm going to bed.